in Ireland. Turn your eyes to the Irish on OPB this week.
Funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour has been provided by ODS Health Plan, the group medical plan that meets the needs of more than 600,000 Oregonians by providing a broad range of medical and dental coverage and responsive service.
Good evening. I'm Jim Lehrer in Washington.
And I'm Robert MacNeil in New York. After the news summary this Monday, we have an update on Bosnia. Then we focus on the move to unseat Oregon Senator Bob Packwood for alleged sexual misconduct. We have excerpts from today's Rules Committee hearing and a debate on the precedent-breaking effort to nullify his election. Next, a look at the British colony of Hong Kong, which reverts to China by treaty in 1997. Finally, San Francisco essayist Richard Rodriguez sees hope in California's hard times.
Funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour has been provided by PepsiCo. PepsiCo. Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the NewsHour is also provided by AT&T and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
President Clinton went back on the stump for his economic plan today. He toured a shopping mall in Cleveland, Ohio, and asked people for their support in getting Congress to pass his program. He said it would help the economy by reducing the deficit and providing investment, but only if it was not picked apart. Later, in a speech to a civic group, he dismissed critics who say he is trying to do too much too quickly.
Bring down the deficit. Do it with spending cuts and tax increases. No tax increases without the spending cuts. Invest in education and training, new technologies, incentives to business, changing the welfare system, and have political reform, face health care. That is a big agenda, but that is America's agenda. If we're going to bring this country back, that is what we must do. I hope you and every American, without regard to political party, in good faith, will ask the United States Congress to engage these issues this year so that we can move this country into the future.
Mr. Clinton will campaign for his economic plan tomorrow in Chicago. The United Mine Workers Union began selective strikes against 3 major coal companies this afternoon. Their contract with 12 companies expired last week, and talks have remained deadlocked. The contract covers 60,000 miners in 6 states. Robin?
United Nations officials in Bosnia reached the embattled Muslim enclave of Žepa today and found it virtually deserted. As late as last week, some 6,000 people lived in the town. It was one of 6 places declared safe areas by the UN last week amid continuous attacks by Bosnian Serb forces. Meanwhile, fighting continued in the southwestern town of Mostar, despite a ceasefire between Muslim and Croat leaders. There were also reports that thousands of Muslims were being forced from the city. The fighting began there before dawn on Sunday, when Croat forces attacked Bosnian military installations. In Washington, State Department spokesman Richard Boucher said a final decision on military action against Bosnia's Serbs was being delayed. He said some U.S. allies in Europe wanted to wait for the results of the Bosnian Serb referendum on the Van-Soen peace plan. The referendum will be held this weekend. Secretary of State Christopher was asked about the delay during a photo session at the State Department.
It's a very dynamic situation. I found in my travels there that some of the countries are more interested in this referendum than the United States is. We still don't think it has much legitimacy, but others of our colleagues there in Europe want to wait until that happens. But the international community is still anxious to take stronger action to them with respect to them, and still anxious to send the signal that the kind of wanton aggression that they're undertaking there is inconsistent with all international standards.
We'll have more on the Bosnia story right after the news summary.
The Senate Rules Committee began consideration today of what to do about Senator Bob Packwood. The specific issue is whether the Oregon Republican can be unseated if it is proven he lied to the press during his election campaign. A group of constituents claim Packwood lied when he denied reports he made unwanted sexual advances to a number of women. His lawyer told the committee today Packwood had not lied. We'll have more on this story later in the program. Senators from the Armed Services Committee took their hearings on gays in the military to Norfolk, Virginia today. They talked with sailors at the Norfolk Naval Base. Most said they supported the ban on gays, and some said they would leave the service if it were lifted. The committee will hear other views when it returns to Washington tomorrow.
That's it for the news summary. Now it's on to Bosnia, the move to unseat Senator Packwood, the future of Hong Kong, and a Rodriguez essay.
We begin tonight with a Bosnia update. It involves two reports. The first is by Gabby Rado of Independent Television News. It starts in the town of Mostar, where a ceasefire has failed to stop fighting between Croats and Muslims.
Even in this most televised of wars, cameras have rarely, if ever, captured the very moment when members of an ethnic group are forcibly rounded up to face deportation, internment, and sometimes death. These pictures, taken by a Spanish TV crew just outside Mostar, show a line of men on what appears to be a forced march. There are no women or children with them, and they're clearly under armed guard. In Mostar, the sight of a group of people in the football stadium seems to confirm reports of Muslims being rounded up to await deportation.
We have been watching buses being taken out with armed HVO, in other words, Croatian, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatian troops in these buses, and some of the people going out have been crossing their arms in front of us, their wrists in front of us, to indicate to us in the universal gesture that they are prisoners.
Elsewhere in Mostar, ferocious gun battles and artillery exchanges between Croatian and Muslim forces continued today, right up to the ceasefire, which was due to take effect 2 hours ago. By their apparent decision to drive out Muslim troops and civilians from the city, the Bosnian Croats have inadvertently helped the Bosnian Serb cause. The world can no longer view the Serbs as sole aggressors in the conflict. UN negotiators on the spot appear to have persuaded the Croats and Muslims to suspend hostilities. But the episode has been held up by Lord Owen as proving that the arms embargo must not be lifted for any side.
The fighting in central Bosnia, if ever anybody believed that the arms embargo was a serious policy or a policy that would bring peace, I think they must surely question it. I mean, if ever anything has demonstrated the nature of the complexity of the situation and the extent of the civil war going on, that certainly is it. And I think to supply arms, which has to be through Croatia anyhow, raises all the problems of it. I see no solution to this problem through lifting the arms embargo.
A Ukrainian force of some 120 men who left Sarajevo yesterday for the Muslim enclave of Zepa in eastern Bosnia arrived there this afternoon. Their task is to turn Zepa into a safe area, as defined by the recent UN Security Council resolution. But a group of UN military observers in Zepa found just 50 people in a town of 6,000. That's because so many have fled into surrounding hills.
There are dead people in several houses. We are also seeing signs that all the houses are destroyed in the area. So unfortunately, it is a pretty devastated area, and we're still going to have to get into the hills to see the full extent of this devastation.
In Brussels, EC foreign ministers met to consider the crisis in light of the Bosnian Serb parliament's rejection of the Vance-Owen peace plan. An offer was made to help President Milosevic enforce his sanctions against the Bosnian Serbs.
We should encourage him to do what he's begun partially to do, which is to enforce a blockade along that border. And we should encourage him by offering to take part in monitoring along that border.
Earlier reports from the Serb-Bosnian border say some, though not all, commercial traffic has been stopped. The real job of any EC monitors sent there will be to make sure that the Serbian president is keeping his promise.
Now we switch the scene to a nearby Muslim enclave in Serbia called Sanjak, where there are reports of fighting and ethnic cleansing. Nick Gowing of Independent Television News has this story.
The town of Priboj on Serbia's southernmost border with Bosnia. The war is beyond the frontier marked by this mountain ridge. Here inside Serbia itself, in villages just over these hills, Muslims are being driven from their villages by Serb paramilitaries, while Serbia's army and police look on. In Priboj, those who have survived relate the grim story now emerging. How in 15 border villages on Serbian soil their houses were attacked and robbed, and how they fled in fear, in some cases after houses were set on fire and Muslim occupants killed, while Serb houses were left untouched.
It is a kind of ethnic cleansing. The same thing that is happening in Bosnia is happening here, the same principle. We aren't guilty of anything, except that we are Muslims.
Checking the claims independently is impossible. The border villages are sealed off. But the evidence points to a systematic effort by irregular Serb forces to create a 13-mile-wide border zone free of Muslim villages west of Priboj and inside Serbia. The alleged incidents against Muslims, including killings, have been taking place for some months. But accounts to us and Western monitors from villagers like this woman who fled 3 weeks ago and is now trying to rebuild her life elsewhere suggest the attacks on Muslims are now at a higher level. The local opposition member of parliament, himself a Serb, confirms that such events are taking place. He's been denied access to the area and calls the incident a scandal which cannot be excused.
From
the other side, there are paramilitary formations. They're using the Bosnia war to bring in fear.
And remove the Muslims at the same time.
Yes, yes. I do not know what their basic motives are, but robbery is one of them.
The Sanjak area straddles Bosnia, Serbia, and Montenegro. Its beauty masks ethnic turmoil which since the Ottoman Empire has ravaged this wealthy traditional trading crossroads between east and west. 2/3 of Sanjak's population is Muslim. Since the war began in Bosnia, constant contacts between Muslim leaders and Serb officials administering the region have defused the potential for Serb-Muslim suspicions to boil over. But Muslim political leaders say the attacks at the border make them fear that darker Serb forces are now at work.
The atmosphere in Sanjak is tense as never before. Serbia and Montenegro are wounded. It is well known that the wounded lion is the worst and most dangerous.
One incident in particular has led to a Muslim belief that radical Serbs are moving to provoke Sanjak's Muslim majority. Just north of here, the main railway line from Belgrade travels through 8 miles of Bosnia. 3 months ago, 40 paramilitaries stopped a train bound for Sanjak. When it eventually arrived at the mainly Muslim town of Pripolje, 15 miles inside Sanjak, 24 Muslim passengers were missing. Distraught relatives have pieced together what the soldiers did.
After checking identity cards, they took the passengers of Muslim nationality. One soldier in front of each passenger, and 2, 3, or 4 meters behind. So there was no chance for them to resist.
The atmosphere in Sanjak is currently stable but jumpy. Responding to the mounting evidence, the federal government says these kinds of incidents are what happens in war.
Some massive resettlements were happening because people were urged to leave by so-called Muslim Party, the Party for Democratic Action. They want to create the political tension. They were telling their members to leave their villages, and later they would use this for pressure on Yugoslavia.
The Bosnian Serb military commander, General Mladic, has now pointed out very publicly the Sanjak problem. One can only guess whether such a mention alone will be taken by Serb paramilitaries as the tacit approval to stir up trouble here in Sanjak.
Still to come on the NewsHour tonight, the Packwood argument, giving Hong Kong back to China, and a Richard Rodriguez essay.
Next, the unprecedented move to unseat Senator Bob Packwood. Petitioners from Oregon claim that Senator Packwood lied to reporters and intimidated his accusers in order to block news stories about his sexual conduct. Today, the Senate Rules Committee heard legal arguments on whether he should be unseated for allegedly defrauding voters. We'll debate whether these are grounds on which to nullify an election after a report by Kwame Holman.
It was a clearly uncomfortable Senator Bob Packwood who faced the press last December.
My actions were wrong. Anytime you do anything that's offensive to somebody, men or women, boys or girls, you call them what you want, it is wrong. Period. Whether in or out of office, it is wrong. My conduct was wrong. And I apologize for that. My conduct was simply wrong.
It was the senator's first public response to charges now by 23 women that he sexually harassed them over a period of 2 decades. The allegations were first detailed on the front page of the Washington Post.
Mr. Packwood.
Packwood stayed out of his home state of Oregon for a month until after he was sworn in to the 5th Senate term he won narrowly in November. When he did go home, demonstrators were waiting for him.
Bob Packwood has to go! Hey, hey!
Newspapers, pundits, and polls in Oregon called for Packwood's resignation, largely based on the belief he lied about the harassment charges to stop the story from coming out before Election Day.
He stole the election. He really short-circuited our process, and that offends me right to the core.
The Senate Ethics Committee will decide what, if any, disciplinary action should be taken against Packwood. Today's hearing before the Rules Committee, however, centered on whether Packwood's recent election should stand. Catherine Meyer, a lawyer representing 250 Oregonians, said it should not.
Petitioners contend that particularly in light of the offensiveness of the underlying conduct, which Mr. Packwood deliberately lied about and hid from the voters, that he would not have won the November 3rd election had he not succeeded in keeping that crucial information from them. Under all of these circumstances, the Oregon voters have asked this committee to investigate their charges, to determine whether the evidence is sufficient to declare the election invalid.
Packwood's alleged sexual conduct was not at issue in today's hearing. The question was whether the Senate has the grounds and the authority to nullify his re-election. Meyer argued the Senate has both.
The Senate has in the past numerous times investigated charges that a candidate's conduct interfered with the integrity of the electoral process, and that is what this matter is about. While those cases most typically involve vote buying or ballot tampering, they also involve intimidation of voters in an effort to make them vote in a particular way. This case is similar to those cases. Here, rather than intimidate the voters directly, the senator threatened and intimidated those with information of importance to the voters. That information was crucial to the voters' ability to make an informed decision about how to cast their votes. The outcome is the same, an impermissible interference with the integrity of the electoral process. This is precisely the kind of matter which the Constitution authorizes the Senate to investigate. In conclusion, I want to stress that at this stage, petitioners are only asking this committee to formally investigate their charges against Senator Packwood. If the committee conducts an investigation and determines that the evidence does not warrant throwing out the November 3rd election, so be it. That will be the decision of the committee. My clients won't be happy with that decision, but at least they will feel that they've had their day in court. If, on the other hand, the Senate declines to even investigate petitioners' charges of election misconduct, that will send a very clear and disturbing message to not only the Oregon voters, but to the nation as a whole, that lying to the voters and silencing those with important information to the electorate is permissible politics as usual in this country.
Representing Senator Packwood was Washington Attorney James Fitzpatrick.
These petitions raise, as we point out, constitutional questions, but more significantly, as a matter of discretion and policy, it's simply a bad idea. At the outset, one should note that there's an element of unreality to this argument today. It proceeds on the basis of a series of allegations which, for purpose of this legal argument, are to be treated as if they were true and accurate. And the statements from petitioner's counsel contains a lot of very hot statements in terms of those accusations. For the record, and I want to emphasize this point, we simply do not accept as valid these factual assertions. Indeed, as we've pointed out in our brief, they fall under their own weight. This is a case of alleged fraud without the fraud. We believe that under the controlling standards, Senator Packwood meets all constitutional qualifications and is duly elected. Nevertheless, petitioners would create a new test of whether a candidate was duly elected. That test would put the Senate in the business of conducting fraud trials to evaluate statements made in the heat of a campaign to determine whether there may have been a material misrepresentation of a historical personal fact and that statement turned the election in the winner's favor. Petitioners cloak this inquiry as one that would look into election fraud. But this expands the Senate's existing and historical concern with election fraud beyond any recognizable limits. Petitioners are using the concept of fraud as a catch-all when their real complaint is with Senator Packwood's alleged behavior, a matter being actively pursued before the Ethics Committee. Even though the Senate has authority to determine what constitutes election fraud, and it's done so in the past in a very narrow class of activities dealing with the voting process itself, it should squarely reject the petitioner's proposal that alleged misrepresentation to the press constitute election fraud. The Senate has never done that in the past, and it shouldn't do so now.
But before Packwood's colleagues, the burden of proof appeared to rest on Meyer.
I think you're before the wrong forum, ma'am, if you'll forgive me. But are you proposing that the Senate ignore a validly issued certificate of election which was never challenged at the state level?
Yes, that's exactly what we're alleging here. And first of all, it was challenged at the state level. The fact that it was, the Secretary of State made it clear he had no authority to investigate charges that Mr. Packwood should not have been given the certificate of election because the only authority he had was to decide who got the most votes. And he made it further clear that the only body that could determine whether or not Senator Packwood was duly elected was this body.
The committee now will review the arguments of both sides and decide within the next few weeks whether to begin its own investigation to determine whether a new election is warranted.
But should campaign misstatements or even lies on personal matters be considered fraud and therefore grounds for overturning an election? We have two quite different views. Stephen Gillers is a professor of legal ethics at New York University Law School. Norman Ornstein is a resident scholar and longtime Congress watcher at the American Enterprise Institute. Norman, first, as we've heard, the issue facing the Rules Committee is not sexual harassment, but in the present, or sexual conduct, but in the present political atmosphere, and you heard the defense attorney there saying that the petitioners are really cloaking their real motive in these legal arguments, is the political issue raising the heat on these senators who are going to decide on the Rules Committee?
Oh, I think there's no question, Robin, that a good part of the reason that the Rules Committee even decided to take this up was that they were feeling some political heat. This is a highly controversial case. An awful lot of groups are out there making a great big deal out of it, and that's why they decided to bring it up in the first place. I think they may regret that before they're done because it raises all kinds of issues that leave them in a difficult situation, but that's why they're taking it up.
Well, we'll come back to that in a moment. Do you agree that in the background, all those senators, although they're deciding on a narrow legal issue, are looking over the heads at all the women who are outraged at the time of the Anita Hill hearings and so on?
Absolutely. I think the Thomas Hill hearings has changed the map.
Yeah.
And the fact that this fraud involves alleged sexual assault makes a big difference.
Okay. Now, let's try and frame the issue facing the Rules Committee. It's really two issues, isn't it? Did Packwood lie to the media, and did he intimidate witnesses? Can you define the issues as
Right.
you see them.
Sure. The Constitution gives the Senate the power to judge elections. That's an unqualified power. In fact, there's no one else who can ultimately do it. The Senate must exercise that authority, and in doing so, it must have all the power that a local board of elections has, which includes the power to review allegations of fraud. Here, the allegation of fraud is that Packwood, before Election Day, denied the sexual assault charges, and after Election Day, he remembered that they might be true and apologized, as we saw on the clip. That's the fraud, and the allegation is further made that it would have made a difference to the election. Separately and independently, there's an allegation that Packwood and his associates set in motion an intimidation campaign to make sure that the press did not get the story from anyone else who knew it. That's obstruction of democracy.
And they alleged that they did what precisely?
Precisely that he began to gather very intimate personal information about women who would know enough to corroborate the story. And then they let it be known that they had this information by word of mouth, by gossip, and women who indeed did have sufficient data to corroborate the story refused to cooperate with the press thereafter. So the allegation, and it still deserves to be investigated, it may or may not be true, is that there was an intimidation campaign. You go forward with this story, and we'll let these facts out about you.
And Norm, do you define the issues, you frame the issues in the same way?
Well, certainly the way there's no doubt that those are some of the material issues, but of course the bigger issue is what constitutes fraud in an election. And in effect, what we're talking about is going well beyond a standard that basically has applied for 200 years when the Congress has taken up the question of a disputed election, which is voter fraud itself, fraud that's involved ballot stuffing or basically keeping people from going to the polls and the like, or instances where you had such a close election that you really had to look at ballots to see if there were problems there, to including questions of this sort, lying or anything that involves the campaign itself. That's the big issue here. It's the question of how far you go.
Well, should lying, if it hasn't been in the past, should it be now a ground for nullifying an election?
My case would be that absolutely not. That once you cross over the line, and I think the framers, and we had elections that were far more robust in terms of lies and charges and intimidation 200 years ago than we have today. Once you cross that line and decide that you're going to make this kind of a judgment, you can't stop. You have instances of lies, of last-minute charges made against opponents, of all kinds of chicanery going on. It's a give and take in an election. It's an awful process in many ways, but the only way in which you can make it work is to make sure that you've got opponents having that give and take and a press that gets involved. Once you start to have the Senate judge after the fact whether this crossed the line, you're going to have a partisan process, and you're going to have a process that will drive the country into a million pieces.
Now, you don't agree with that. You think that lying could be a ground for nullifying an election, right?
Absolutely. Mr. Ornstein's position trivializes a constitutional power. What he's saying is that the Senate is reduced to the role of bean counter. It can count the votes and say, no, there were 100, not 99. Fraud has to be a basis to vacate an election victory. It may not mean that you always do it. Other things come into play, but the Senate has to be able.
But is a misstatement of fact, deliberate or not, deliberate fraud in this context?
It can be. What if the candidate lied about his taking bribes in the past? What if the question to the senator was, we have information that you took bribes, and he said, no, I never did, knowing he had, and then was elected, and then it came to light that he had. Is the Senate disempowered from refusing to seat that person who has taken bribes in the past?
Norm?
If you get to a point where those kinds of things become qualifications for election, beyond ballot stuffing or fraud of that sort, lies during the course of a campaign about one's record, about one's past, or about one's opponent, where do you stop? We've had instances in the past where we had candidates who came up with last-minute charges, outrageous charges about their opponents, clear lies, and they knew it. Do we say that election after the fact is invalid? There are going to be mistakes made during the course of a campaign where people lie. Here we have an instance where you're talking about charges that were 25 years old. We went through 3 election campaigns or more for the Senate where Bob Packwood won after these incidents had occurred. allegations come up right before this election, and they're put back by, no question, lying and very possibly intimidation here, but you can't start to get into this, whether they have the constitutional power formally or not, without going down a slippery slope that leads to disaster.
The Constitution is constantly being reinterpreted. There is a public mood of great mistrust in politicians at the moment. Do you think saying that lying is not a disqualification for holding a Senate seat is a proposition that won't go today?
If you decided that lying was a qualification, it's not being very facetious to say that we wouldn't have very many people holding offices almost anywhere. Lies and distortions and exaggerations are a part of this process. Now, sure, there are some that are more trivial than others. But once you start into that, when you have a partisan chamber, imagine if we have a Senate that's 51-49 after a very tough election campaign. Won't the temptation be there to pick and choose among the instances of lying which have taken place, find one and have a partisan majority to move in and invalidate an election? It's a dangerous road.
Let me move on in the time, because I guess you're going to continue to disagree on that one. Let me move on to the other. Should the other issue, alleged intimidation of witnesses in this context, be a ground, can the Rules Committee reasonably decide that is the ground for nullifying an election?
Absolutely. It is. I call that obstruction of democracy. To me, it is no different from intimidating a witness, obstruction of justice. It is also much narrower. If we're worried about the floodgates, there are going to be many fewer such charges. The allegation here is that there was a concerted, conscious effort to scare people by revelation of the most intimate details of their personal life, were they to provide the information that the senator refused to provide, indeed lied about. It seems to me that has to be a basis for vacating an election.
Yeah. Norm, how do you think on that one?
Well, again, we disagree. But let's take another example of something that could be considered similar. Back during the New Hampshire primary campaign in 1988, we had an instance right at the end of that campaign where George Bush and his campaign manager, John Sununu, then governor of New Hampshire, went around to television stations and, one could say, intimidated them into putting their commercials on the air and keeping Bob Dole's commercials off, and it made all the difference in New Hampshire, which ultimately decided a presidential election. Are we going to invalidate an election because a candidate intimidates television stations from putting his opponent's commercials on the air? Where do we stop here without leading into ex post facto decisions?
If you were a senator on the Rules Committee, would you refuse in this case to investigate that allegation in Cat Packwood's case?
I would state, if I were a member of the Rules Committee, that whether we have the theoretical power or not, that the Senate is going to look at instances of voter fraud, ballot stuffing, intimidation of voters at the polls, but not look into allegations of lying or something of this sort as a condition of election. Let the Ethics Committee consider it when it considers the punishment of Senator Packwood for the offenses that have occurred here, but not a question of after an election has taken place, when we can't know what the result would have been otherwise, drawing back from somebody who's won by the normal standards.
You would argue, I presume, that these senators, the duty of these senators is to investigate both of these areas and to rule on whether they disqualify Packwood from holding his seat or not.
The facts so far put forward create a reason to investigate both areas. I think the Senate demeans itself if it denies itself the power to do so, because nobody else can do so, and it means you can steal an election.
Let's come back to the point, finally, that I raised in the first place. Norm, are you wondering in your own mind, from all your knowledge of Congress, whether the new atmosphere we described, both out in the country and in the part of women who were so upset about the Anita thing, may create in the minds of these senators a predisposition to investigate this or to rule on it when in the past they might have brushed it off?
You know, it was very clever of the lawyer for the 250 Oregonians to say, whatever your outcome, investigate this, to try and cross that threshold now. And there is going to be a temptation to say, we can put these people off if we just investigate. Once you cross that threshold, though, it's very difficult to step back. And I think there'll be some senators who will say, wait a minute, we can't get into this or we'll never stop.
And it is part of your argument that the new atmosphere makes more imperative, is it?
Making those kinds of judgments is what public office is all about. I don't think the Senate has to stop itself before it goes too far. I think it can exercise a wise discretion once it begins to investigate. I'm not fearful that it will go too far at all.
Well, Professor Gillers and Norman Ornstein, thank you both.
Now to the China story and the argument over trade and human rights. Our focus tonight is Hong Kong. There are new tensions between China and Britain over the colony of Hong Kong, and some of that has been spilling over into American relations with China. The man in the middle of all this is Hong Kong's British governor, Chris Patten. We will talk to Mr. Patten after this backgrounder by Charles Kraus.
Hong Kong is the last great jewel in Britain's imperial crown, a reminder of the days when the sun never set on the British Empire. But today, there are more Americans in Hong Kong than there are Englishmen, and the United States is the colony's largest overseas trading partner. Some $36 billion worth of manufactured goods and food go back and forth between the United States and Hong Kong each year. Meanwhile, U.S. corporations and individuals have invested heavily in Hong Kong's thriving economy. But trade and investment are not the only reasons for U.S. interest. The Clinton administration is following political developments in Hong Kong closely because of growing concern about democracy and human rights in the colony once it's reincorporated into communist China. Those political concerns have grown in Hong Kong itself since Chris Patten's appointment as governor. As chairman of Britain's Conservative Party, Patten played a key role helping Prime Minister John Major win re-election last year. But in that same election, Patten lost his own seat in Parliament. Out of a job, Major named him governor of Hong Kong. He arrived in Hong Kong's spectacular harbor a year ago, and he'll probably be the last British governor there. In 1997, after 156 years of British rule, Hong Kong will once again become a part of China. Yet despite his status as a lame duck, Patten has turned what could have been just a ceremonial post into a bully pulpit, pressing for democratic guarantees and more elected officials in Hong Kong before it reverts to China 4 years from now.
In case there should be any doubt in the minds of anyone in this council or outside it, let me clearly state this afternoon that the British government stands foursquare behind the Hong Kong government's proposals on constitutional development in Hong Kong and will continue to do so.
Patten's speech last fall was immediately denounced by the Chinese government in Beijing, which had not been consulted beforehand. Beijing accused Patten of trying to reopen issues that had already been decided. But in Hong Kong itself, the governor's speech and his moves since then have met with a far more positive response. Many in Hong Kong are openly enthusiastic. Others, especially some businessmen with close ties to Beijing, feared a confrontation. They were and remain critical. But even they understand the links between democratic guarantees and future economic stability, links which Patten is trying to strengthen before it's too late. At stake is the world's 10th largest trading economy. Hong Kong has a 6% annual growth rate and an unemployment rate that hovers around an enviable 1.5%. But economic stability depends on confidence. And after the Chinese crackdown in Tiananmen Square 4 years ago, many Chinese in Hong Kong became deeply concerned, fearful for their future once the British leave. Patten's effort to secure their political